Welcome to Wisdom on the Go, where we explore the greatest ideas in philosophy and their impact on modern life. Today, we're tackling one of the most influential and controversial concepts from Plato, the Philosopher-King. Can enlightened leadership and wisdom create a better world? Or is this just an impossible utopia?
And more importantly, does Plato's ideal of the philosopher-king actually help us live better lives? I'm skeptical. Power and wisdom don't always go hand in hand, and history shows us that intellectual elites can be just as corrupt as anyone else.
But what if they weren't? Plato believed that rulers should be trained in wisdom, justice, and virtue, rather than self-interest and greed. He envisioned a society led by philosopher-kings, those who seek truth above all else.
Sounds great in theory, but can we trust anyone to wield that kind of power without corruption?
Let's start with Plato's vision. In the Republic, he argues that the best rulers are those who do not seek power for personal gain, but who are forced into leadership because they are the most capable and wise. He sees democracy as flawed because it allows unqualified individuals to lead, guided by populism rather than reason.
That's a dangerous idea, though. Who decides who the wise rulers are? And even if we find them, power tends to corrupt. Plato assumes that philosophers, by their nature, are incorruptible. History suggests otherwise.
True, but Plato's point was that rulers must undergo rigorous training in ethics, mathematics, dialectic, and governance. They would be philosopher-kings, not because they desired power, but because they were the only ones fit to wield it.
So he proposes a sort of intellectual aristocracy? But doesn't that assume that the wise always know what's best for everyone else?
Not exactly. The idea is that wisdom and virtue go together. A philosopher-king wouldn't act out of self-interest, but out of a duty to truth and justice.
And yet, we've seen throughout history that even the most well-intentioned rulers can be blind to the needs of ordinary people. Wisdom alone doesn't guarantee moral leadership.
So how do we apply this today? If we can't have literal philosopher-kings, can we at least integrate Plato's principles into our leadership structures?
Maybe, but first, let's admit that no single person, no matter how wise, has a monopoly on truth. Modern democratic systems are flawed, but they allow for checks and balances.
Fair point. But we do see a lack of philosophical thinking in modern leadership. Shouldn't we demand more education in ethics, logic, and rational discourse from those in power?
That I can agree with. But I think real wisdom comes from collective governance, not a single enlightened ruler. Maybe instead of philosopher-kings, we need philosopher-citizens.
Let's shift the focus to personal development. If we can't live in a society ruled by philosopher-kings, can we at least become philosopher-kings in our own lives?
That's an interesting take. But what would that actually look like?
It means leading with reason and virtue. Plato's ideal ruler cultivates wisdom through education, reflection, and discipline. Imagine if we approached our personal decisions this way, always striving for truth instead of convenience.
That sounds noble, but is it realistic? People are emotional, social creatures. Can we really train ourselves to be purely rational decision makers?
Not purely rational, no. But we can integrate philosophy into daily life, practicing Socratic questioning, being mindful of our motivations, and constantly seeking self-improvement.
That makes sense. So, in practical terms, we should ask ourselves, am I making choices based on wisdom or impulse? Am I ruling over my own life with justice and reason?
One of the biggest obstacles to a philosophical life today is distraction. Social media, entertainment, and consumer culture all pull us away from deep thinking. Plato warned against this. He saw the masses as easily swayed by appearances rather than truth.
And that's another problem. Plato didn't trust the common person's judgment. But isn't part of modern wisdom learning how to engage with others rather than retreating into intellectual elitism?
Of course. But there's a difference between engaging meaningfully and being consumed by noise. A philosopher-king wouldn't spend hours scrolling through Twitter debates.
True, but even the pursuit of wisdom can become an ivory tower. There's value in staying connected to everyday struggles. Maybe true wisdom isn't just about knowing what is right, but also about knowing how to act on it in a flawed world.
So, where does that leave us? Is Plato's vision useful or just a utopian dream?
I think the ideal of the philosopher-king is dangerous when taken literally, but valuable as a personal philosophy. We can strive for wisdom without assuming that a single enlightened person should rule.
Agreed. Maybe the true lesson isn't that we need philosopher-kings, but that we need to cultivate wisdom in all aspects of life: leadership, education, and personal growth.
So, the best way to live isn't to wait for a wise ruler, but to seek wisdom ourselves.
Precisely. If everyone pursued wisdom the way Plato imagined, maybe we wouldn't need philosopher-kings at all.
A fitting paradox to end on. Thanks for tuning in to Wisdom on the Go. Keep thinking deeply, and we'll see you next time.
As we continue exploring this idea, let's look at it from another angle. In the last chapter, we discussed the philosopher-king. But now, let's see how this applies in a different context. The core idea remains the same, but with a fresh perspective and new insights.
What if the perfect ruler was someone who never wanted to rule at all? That's exactly what the ancient philosopher Plato proposed with his radical idea of the philosopher-king.
You know what fascinates me about this concept? How completely opposite it is to our modern political system where people spend billions just trying to get elected.
And that's exactly what Plato was worried about. In the Republic, he argues that anyone actively seeking power is probably the least qualified to have it. These philosopher-kings would need years of training in mathematics, ethics, and dialectic before they'd be considered ready to lead.
But wouldn't forcing reluctant philosophers to rule just create resentful leaders?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Plato believed that true philosophers would understand their duty to society. It's like how ancient Cincinnatus left his farm to lead Rome in crisis, then immediately returned to farming once the job was done.
That's such a rare example, though. I mean, looking at history, even well-educated rulers often became corrupted by power.
You're right, and that's why modern scholars like Martha Nussbaum argue that Plato's real message wasn't about creating perfect rulers, but about the importance of combining wisdom with practical governance.
So, what you're saying is we should focus less on finding these perfect philosopher-kings and more on bringing philosophical thinking into leadership?
Exactly. And here's where it gets really applicable to our lives today. Studies show that leaders with humanities backgrounds often make more ethical decisions. There was this fascinating 2019 study showing that CEOs with liberal arts degrees were 30% more likely to consider long-term societal impacts in their decision-making.
Oh, wow. I hadn't heard that statistic. Though I wonder if that's correlation or causation.
Well, let's look at how this applies to personal development. Instead of waiting for some perfect wise ruler, what if we became philosopher-kings of our own lives? Research shows that people who regularly engage in philosophical reflection make better decisions and report higher life satisfaction.
That's interesting, but how do we actually do that in our hyper-distracted world? I mean, we're bombarded with information 24/7.
You know what's fascinating? The average person now makes over 35,000 decisions per day. That's a 40% increase from just 20 years ago. Plato would probably see this as exactly the kind of challenge that requires philosophical thinking.
35,000 decisions? That's absolutely mind-boggling.
Right? And here's where Plato's ideas become super relevant. He talked about the importance of training our minds to see through illusions and focus on what's truly important. In our social media age, that's more crucial than ever.
Though I have to point out, isn't there something a bit elitist about assuming only philosophers can make good decisions?
That's a fair criticism. And modern philosophers like Amartya Sen have argued that wisdom often comes from diverse perspectives and experiences, not just academic training. But the core principle, that leadership requires both knowledge and ethical reasoning still holds true.
So maybe instead of philosopher-kings, we need what you might call philosopher-citizens?
Exactly. And some companies are already moving in this direction. Google, for example, has started incorporating ethical philosophy into their AI development teams. They found that teams with philosophical training were 25% better at identifying potential ethical issues in new technologies.
Now, that's a practical application I wouldn't have expected.
And it goes beyond just business decisions. Studies show that people who regularly engage in philosophical thinking are more resistant to misinformation and make more consistent ethical choices. They're essentially becoming philosopher kings of their own information consumption.
You know what's really striking about this whole conversation? How relevant these ancient ideas still are to modern problems.
Absolutely right. And here's the really powerful takeaway. While we might not need literal philosopher kings, we desperately need philosophical thinking in our lives. Whether we're making personal decisions, leading organizations, or just trying to navigate our complex world. These principles of seeking wisdom and ethical understanding are more important than ever.
So, the real message isn't about creating perfect rulers, but about developing wisdom in ourselves.
That's it exactly. And maybe that's the most important lesson from Plato's philosopher-king concept. The path to a better world starts with each of us becoming better thinkers, more ethical decision makers, and more thoughtful citizens. Thanks for joining us on this philosophical journey, everyone.